Hey geeks, welcome to another exciting episode of Rockin The Code World with dotNetDave. I'm David McCarter. I'm really glad you're all here today. I've missed you. We were off last week recovering from the 20th anniversary of Microsoft.net. So we're back in action this week, and we have a great show lined up this week. We have a great show lined up next week. And hey to everybody saying hi. I'm glad you're all here. So this week, my special guest will be Bill Penberthy. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Bill. You'll tell me. And we're going to be talking about microservices and some of the pitfalls that microservices can have. And I've been using microservices for a while now, and even the very first time I used it, and maybe I'll talk about this a little bit more when Bill gets on. I already saw the dangers the first time I started using microservices. I said to myself, and I might have said this to a reporter because I was actually interviewed for this magazine. And I said, this is really cool and can be really great, but I can see where it can go really, really bad. And so I'm really interested to see what Bill says about this. And so he'll be coming up in a couple minutes. I want to start off the show talking about the Ukraine. Unfortunately, we all know that Putin and Russia has invaded the Ukraine this week. And it's been definitely sad for me because I've been to the Ukraine and I have friends there. And, back in 2015, I was invited by this outsourcing company in the Ukraine to go speak there. And it was actually my first international speaking gig of all my years of, I think when I went there, I was speaking 21 years. And that was my first time I actually went overseas somewhere. And I had just the best time in the Ukraine. I don't have enough time to tell you just how much I liked it. Not only did I like speaking at this conference, this is a picture of me speaking there, but I really liked a lot of other aspects of the Ukraine too. I was really grateful that the conference allowed me to play guitar before my session. I didn't smash it, but I did throw it. I did jump off the stage and throw it back on the stage for a little rock star moment, I guess. I'm not sure. I saw a lot of big eyes in the Ukrainian people. I was going, what? It's crazy Americans here throwing guitars around. But I had just a great time. And it was the first time that I was treated really, really well by a conference. I mean, this conference bent over backwards to make sure I was taken care of, made sure my dietary needs were taken care of. And, before I went there, I told them, look, if I'm traveling halfway across the world, I just don't want to come in and leave. I want to learn about the Ukraine. So the conference did something amazing that no other conference has ever done. And that was they hired for 2 days a private tour guide for me, just me and Diana. That's it. And the first day we actually had, I had my own private driver too, because we went out into the countryside and her and I visited some castles built in 11th and 12th centuries, which was really mind-boggling for me because we don't have castles in America. We have fake ones, like at Disneyland and stuff like that. We don't have real ones in America. So to go in the real castle that was built so long ago was just really amazing. And then the second day that Diana was with me, she took me on a walking tour of Lviv. That's where I was. I was literally like one building away from the town square of Lviv, where a lot of the reporting on the news is coming from right now. So, and I got to learn more about Lviv and everything about the culture there and everything. I even bought a Ukrainian shirt that I haven't worn since because I haven't gone back because I really want to go back. I love the Ukraine. The food there is amazing. Oh my gosh. And the coffee, best coffee I've ever had was in the Ukraine. The only thing I had a little trouble with is vodka. Man, those people know their vodka and it is strong. I couldn't go like this they probably thought I was an idiot American. And it's a beautiful city. This is actually a picture that I took from the top of my hotel. The top of my hotel had this restaurant up there that I would go hang out in the afternoons, and if I had time. And I shot this picture, as you can see, right around sunset. And so Ukraine is just a beautiful country. I've been wanting to go back ever since. I've been trying to get back there, and I haven't been able to go back. And so I know that's a story about my trip, but I just want to have everybody take a moment after the show and think about what's going on in Ukraine and what that means to the whole world. And if you're able to support the people in Ukraine, especially if you live closer, I hope that you do. I know there's a lot of organizations you can donate money to if you want to do it that way. But please, keep Ukraine in your thoughts and prayers while they go through this terrible ordeal with Russia, and help support them as much as you can. I mean, we're all in this together. It's a world. We're all one world, right? We're not just separate countries anymore. All right. I have a new article out on CSharpCorner. It's called Classes, Structures, and Records Oh My. This is actually a Twitter comment I got from Mahesh, actually made a comment. And so I wrote this article. So I tried to find all the major differences between all three of these different types in .NET and list them all in this article. Because I couldn't really find just one article that did that. And so I made sure I tried to find everything I could. So anyway, I hope you will check it out. And with that, I want to bring on Bill. Bill's first commercial application went live more than 30 years ago. And since that time, he's spent most of his time life wrapped around up in SDLC. He lives up in Seattle. Probably half of that time, he's been a consultant, mostly around .NET development, focused mainly on the web, until several years ago when his focus switched to cloud native and distributed computing. He has written 2 books on ASP.NET, is currently about halfway through his third, called Pro.NET on AWS, who will be published by Apress, one of my publishers in the past, in Q3. He has presented over 15 conferences in the last 3 years. Wow, even during the pandemic, that's pretty good. With most of the sessions being around software architecture, distributed computing, and microservices. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thanks a lot, Mr. dotNetDave. And I just wanted to follow up with your comments about the Ukraine situation. I spent a couple of years working with an offshore team based in Ukraine, and they were some of the sharpest and best developers that I had ever worked with.
They are.
And I spent some time, just yesterday, trying to get a hold of them, and I've been unable to reach any of them. And so it's things like that make this become very personal for people. And,
that's why it's personal for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to call out and thank you for that, because it was something that I'd been thinking about for a while, and I'm glad that you brought it up like that.
Yeah, when I was there, you are totally correct. And after I came back from the Ukraine, I haven't said this in a long time, but after I came back, I was telling everybody, I have never been asked questions so hard during a conference talk than in the Ukraine, right? Yeah. They are tough on you. Oh my gosh. I never answered so many times, I don't know, when I'm speaking in front of people than in the Ukraine, Yeah. So I was really impressed with them. And I was also impressed, it's a longer story, but I was also impressed that, 40% of the IT people are women, which we definitely don't have that in America, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think there were 6 developers and a couple of QA members on the team. So I think the team altogether was maybe 9 or 10, and it was probably 50% women. And not just in the PM and QA roles, which you tend to see here in the US, but
And even when I was there, it was 2015, right? So that was a year after, Russia started taking over the eastern part of the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so I was asking this outsourcing company, who I actually worked with when I came back. I got them a gig here in San Diego for one of the companies here. It's probably the reason they had brought me out there. And And I asked, one of the guys who ran the company probably at dinner one night, and I asked him, so there's some fighting going on over there. Do you guys have a plan? And he goes, oh yeah, we have a plan. If it gets too close to us, we're going to Poland. So even back in 2015, tech companies already had a plan for this, right? And so I hope all of them got out and are safe. Or if they chose to stay, they are safe, and especially if they chose to stay and serve in the military, right? Because it's already all the way up to 60. I mean, you can't leave the country now if you're 18 to 60, right? And so I hope everybody stays safe there. My thoughts and prayers will always be with you until this is over and the country recovers. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I just want to thank you so much for speaking at the .NET Virtual Conference in January. That's why I asked you to be on the show. I watched your episode and I really liked it, and so I invited you back. So,
I appreciate it. So, just for everybody out, how about a little bit of background for me? Dave gave a good one, but let me just talk a little bit more about what brought this to me. So in the last probably 4 or 5 years, I've been doing a lot of work around bringing large monolithic applications to microservices. So you're kind of have got this approach about how everything fits together. And then when you start thinking about microservices, well, it makes sense, because that means I could just take an order and I can make it a microservice. I could do this and I can make it a microservice. And at some levels and at some scale, that makes sense. You can do something like that. You can kind of take something out as really, an object as you would think about it in your code, and put it into a microservice.
Yeah.
But once you get in there, all of a sudden you realize that it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
So that movement from the big old monolithic .NET application into a service-oriented architecture where you've got the service backends managing it is not really microservices, but a lot of people have that impression.
Right.
And so what I wanted to do is talk about why that doesn't work, what microservices really are, and the problems that you have with those, because
and we should also talk about the pluses too, of course, right?
Oh yeah,
because I've talked about the pluses a lot. I've written about it, but yeah. So one thing I want to make sure before we start our next little segment is, for everybody out there that doesn't know what a microservice is, I want you to explain, really quickly exactly what you call a microservice, right? And a microservice, we use as a umbrella term for, because microservice is not a marketing term, right? It's because in AWS they're called lambdas, and Azure they're called, Azure functions. I don't know what they're called in Google, but so we just use microservices as, it's kind of like we use FedEx, right? It's a fast shipping, right? You know what I'm saying? Is a generic term for the different services, right?
Well, yeah, and actually, we're kind of jumping ahead there, but there's so many different ways to manage those microservices. So you pulled out the functions as a service approach, where you limit it based off, manage your resources based off of just what it is for processing. But there's a lot of times it makes sense, especially like very heavily used systems that are always running, where you instead throw your microservices into a container and you deploy it out that way, because you want to be able to scale it up and down and things like that.
Right.
But the very first slide I have kind of gives a description of microservices. So if we want to jump in on that. So, it's really hard to come up with a definition of microservices, because to be honest, I think what you gave was just a perfect definition of it. So what I instead here was listed some of the things that people use to describe microservices. And I think this is what will make sense for us as we start talking about why it's broken. First of all, like you mentioned, microservices are all communications across some kind of an agnostic protocol like HTTP.
Mhm.
And like I described a little bit there, they tend to be organized around some kind of business capability. And then they tend to be, smaller and more limited in scope. Nowadays, they tend to be message enabled. Ideally, they're going to be independently built and deployed. So that means that you can use different database languages,
Mhm.
uh, different computer languages. You can use different databases behind it. And the thing then that makes this the most interesting is that most microservices theoretically should be responsible for their own data.
Yes.
Now, why would you want to use microservices? Well, you touched on it a little bit, but there's a couple of reasons that leap out as to why microservices make the most sense. And one of them, and probably the largest and most, you know, obvious one, is the modularity, because
Mhm.
you can get logically discrete functions. You can define interfaces so everybody knows what kind of questions to ask and what kind of answers they're going to get back from it. And then you've got the ability for distributed development, because each one of those little microservices can have their own team. I mean, that's what Amazon does, is each one of their services has a two pizza team behind it that all they do is just work on that one little thing.
Mm. Mm.
So that gives you the ability to specialize in something and to be able to look at it as a discrete, almost little micro application, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, and then scalability, obviously. If you think about a lot of the applications that you've worked on, there always tends to be one or two areas that get bogged down. Sometimes it's database access, or sometimes it's some really complicated calculations that are going on.
Mhm.
Well, what this allows you to do is to scale each one of those little modules individually. I mean,
Yes.
if you're thinking about a monolithic application, if you need to scale one part of it, that means you need to scale everything. So the only way to scale that would be just to start throwing more of them out there.
Right.
Now you don't have to do that. You can just scale each individual discrete part of it. And of course,
Sure.
you can scale that vertically by just throwing more processing power at it, at that one particular part of it. Or you can scale it horizontally by just whipping a few more of those services out there. So,
And one of the great things, I think with microservices, especially, if you hear websites going down and stuff, is, they're automatically scalable, right?
right.
It's, you can set it up that, okay, I want, 5 of these running, but if I start getting more hits, spin it up to 10
Yeah.
or whatever to take care of the load. And so, I always think of Comic-Con, right? Because Comic-Con, it goes down every freaking year when they try to sell tickets, right? And
hmm
they could get advantage over microservices and hopefully not go down, right?
Right.
And kind of, I think you touched on it. It's one of the things, to me, I think microservices makes it really easy to basically pair queues and processing, right? Because one of
hmm
the things I've been talking about for decades is that you want to get the user through their workflow as fast as you can, right? And so any work that you can have done later, right?
hmm
And that could be anything. It could be, saving some of the database. It could be resizing images or whatever. You need to throw that off to a separate process so it doesn't bog down, the main process. And
Yep.
microservices makes that, very easy to do.
hmm
Where in a monolithic, application like you were talking about, that would be a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. And that, what you're talking about there, especially around queues and things like that, it can solve so many problems. I mean, you're
Hmm.
starting to see rises of event-driven architecture, which is much
Yes.
the same kind of thing. And what that does is allow, each one of the different pieces is to be able to, listen to things that it cares about throughout the entire part of it and respond to it, which
Yeah.
is hugely powerful. Very
Mm.
complex, but it's hugely powerful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So,
And I just want to touch really quick, and I've written about this. If you guys want to go read about it on my blog, you can do that. But the first time I did like an in production microservice was for this company up in Carlsbad, which is about 10-15 minutes away from me. And I won't go into a long story because I've written about it. But basically when I got there, and basically the reason they hired me was, they had the 600K payload coming in from their mobile devices that gets, sucked into their back end and runs through AI and does and all that kind of stuff. Well, that 600K of data, basically took anywhere from 7 to 70 seconds to ingest, right? And I've never heard of performance so bad, because if I were their mobile user waiting that long, I would go, this is ridiculous, right? And so anyway, they couldn't onboard more bigger contracts. One of the big contracts they wanted to get was from the Houston Astros, the baseball team in America, for those of you who don't live here. And they couldn't do it. The Astros said, no, this is taking too long, and so they hired me. And so when I left, we were in testing, and I had that down to less than 200 milliseconds. And basically all I didn't even touch their code that ingested the 600K payload. All I did was stand a queue and a microservice in front of that, right, along with a gateway. And I got it down to 200 milliseconds, right? And so that to me was going, wow, this is pretty awesome, and allowed, that company to onboard, to sign contracts with, like the Houston Astros. Actually, when I was there, one of the players from the Houston Astros came one day and was milling, touring the company and stuff like that. So they're very powerful, but like we're going to talk about, they can be very dangerous too.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to what you were just saying, a lot of these things you couldn't even really do it before. If you think about the growth of IoT and then the amount of data that's generated from there, I'm working at a client right now that's getting, diagnostic information about their systems. They're getting 35 gigabytes a second. Imagine what that would be like, even 5 years ago, trying to manage it with the systems that they had back then and the kind of architectural approaches and mindsets that a lot of developers had, which just, boggled at that kind of scale of things. But that's becoming commonplace now. I mean, I've heard, I was just at Confu.ca conference in Montreal this last few days. Well, virtually there.
Yeah.
And I was talking with somebody in one of their networking things that their systems bring in over 250 gigabytes of data a second. They're basically tracking users on their video, so watching ice streams and mouses and all of that. So everything that's going on around that is being collected and being streamed to them. And you think about that. I mean, just imagine how many, terabytes. What is that? A terabyte a day, probably, or less, more terabyte every minute.
Yeah, terabyte a minute. Yeah.
That's just crazy.
It is, and if you think of other systems like Facebook and stuff like that, is all they do is track you. They don't care about the rest, right? They just care about tracking you. That's it. Google, Facebook, all those people, they just want to track you, right? Because that's how they make money, because they sell that data to companies, right? So when you're on your phone, everything you're doing is being tracked, right? You're on the web, everything you're doing is being tracked, right? It's everything, and if you don't believe me, just go to any popular website, right mouse click on it and do view page source and look at all the stuff in the page that's just on tracking, right? There's more stuff about tracking on your page than there is about than you're viewing, right?
and every one of those is going to a microservice.
That's right.
So let's get into some of the areas where people start to have problems around understanding what a microservice is.
Yeah.
If you remember that slide, it had the tends to be. Well, here's those tends to be pulled out a little bit, more clear so that we can see what they are. The first one that was listed on there, and it makes intuitive sense, but let's talk through that a little bit more. Smaller and more limited in scope. So, I mentioned earlier the concept of an order. I've got an order thing that so I'll have an order microservice. I'm a website, I sell widgets, I want to be able to sell my widgets. So orders are how I define how my widgets get purchased. So I'm going to have an order microservice. Does that sound appropriate to you?
It can, sure. Yeah, just one, and well, that's what microservices should do. One thing, right?
Right.
One thing only, right? They don't do multiple things. One thing, right? Yeah.
Okay. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So if I'm going to create an order, I would imagine I'd call the order microservice.
Mhm.
If I'm going to ship the order, would I call the order microservice?
No, that'd probably be a different one, I would think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's and that's where it really becomes very complicated.
Yeah.
Um, is trying to figure out what that scope really is, because smaller and more limited in scope. Well, you can't be too big,
Right.
because then you end up, you may not have a monolithic application anymore, but you just have a series of, I don't know, microlithic applications that it's
Yeah.
talking to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can't get too small either, because then, orchestration just becomes a bleeding nightmare at that point.
Yes. Yes. Sure.
So how do you figure out what the boundaries of your microservice are going to be? And that, I think, in many ways is one of the biggest complications that people tend to have around understanding how to build microservices, is to put that boundary around it.
Mhm.
I mean, there's architectural approaches like domain-driven design that kind of give you some guidance around that, but even then, it's really easy to overdefine or underdefine what that service should be doing. And to be honest, I don't know that I would be able to say that there's any guidance that I'd be able to give anybody to say this microservice is the appropriate size. Have
Right.
have you seen anything like that? Is there any kind of an approach
No,
that you've had that you feel consistent across
I
multiple
haven't. I haven't really seen anything. Yeah. I
Yeah.
haven't.
Yeah, so it really comes down to, somebody asks about some kind of a process about how you're going to manage that. It's going to be like, let's talk about your business and what your business is trying to do, and maybe that'll help us understand it.
Yeah.
Because I think that order example that we mentioned is one of the easiest ways to start seeing where things go wrong.
Yeah.
Because of I've got an order. Okay, a discrete order, if it just manages creating the order and editing the order. Oh, sorry, we just had a visitor.
Oh,
uh,
that's your co-speaker. Right?
yeah, she thinks if I'm on camera, she should be on camera somehow.
Of course.
um, boy, now I'm all distracted.
Now I'm thinking about my cat.
yeah, nothing like a cat just jumping on your lap in the middle of a sentence to kind of whack you out of breath. But I think we were talking about how do you
orchestration, I
define
think.
that? Yeah, so
Yeah.
so creating an order and editing an order, okay, that makes sense maybe in its own little process. But then shipping it.
Right.
You mentioned that that could probably be a different one, and I've
Sure.
seen that implemented as part of a shipping service,
Right.
where it would then go as part of what that shipping service was doing. It would update the order so that it would understand that it's been shipped.
Mhm.
Um, but then that's where you start getting into the next thing, messaging enabled. Well,
Mhm.
that would mean if you're going to be expecting those kinds of differentiation, if you're going to scale down the services and the responsibilities of each service so that they're more discrete, well, then those things have to spend more time talking to each other.
Yes.
And then that's then the next way off that you have to do is, as I'm tightening the work that's being done by my microservice, I have to increase the amount of information that my microservice is going to make available to every other microservice,
Mhm.
because I don't know what they're going to find useful.
Right.
So at some point, then the next problem is, how do I define what those messages are that are going to be going out there? Um, I've seen some approaches where they basically just send out a URL that says, "Hey, this order is now different. If you care, make that service call and go find out everything about the order, and then you can pick
Yes.
and choose what's going on."
Yeah. Yeah. Like
I've
with
seen,
events, right?
yeah,
With
yep,
eventing. Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. I've seen other approaches where they just send out, a JSON blob of everything that's different.
Mhm.
So if it's a new one, it'll just be, the order,
Hmm.
or if it's, changed one, it could show either both the old and the new data as part of the message, or just the new data,
Right.
and then you have to kind of, as each service is listening to it, they have to kind of figure out what they care about.
Yeah, and
Well,
especially like you were alluding to a little bit ago, that's especially important when if you go to the architecture where, one microservice, one data store, right?
yeah,
And so that becomes a big deal if you're doing something like that, right? You're not connecting to a
a shared,
application-wide data service,
yeah,
shared data service,
yeah.
right? You're connecting to just one for that microservice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and then that means all of a sudden you have to start worried about, strong consistency versus eventual consistency.
Right,
When
right,
when does each service have to actually know that something's changed? Can it wait
right.
a few milliseconds? Can it wait a few seconds? Heck, I mean, can it wait a few minutes because maybe that service that does that is, being deployed because you want these all to be independently built and deployed.
Right.
So you always have to think that as you're building out each one of these. It's cat fur all over the place now. As you're building out each one of these microservices, they have to be able to stand alone.
Yes.
So that means you can't depend on anybody else telling you anything, and you can't depend on anybody else listening to you. And what does that mean as you're trying to build out the architecture?
Yeah.
And it's really easy at that point to just, throw your hands up and say, I don't care anymore. I'm going to go be.
I'll put it out there. I don't care.
I'm going to go be a truck driver. And maybe that's why I'm a consultant, is because I build the thing and then I run away screaming, so I don't have to try to worry about maintaining it.
Yeah.
But all of these basically show how something that seems so simple when you look at this list of items here really isn't, because
No.
it's like a balloon. You squeeze one part of it and another part bubbles out, and that's exactly what you're going to find as you're trying to understand the system that you're building around your microservices.
Right.
Because a lot of people look at a microservices, this is what this has to do, and that's fine, but it's a very simplistic approach, because you have to look at that microservice in the scheme of the entire system that it's supporting, and you
Yes.
have to look at it not just in the system that you have now that you're building, but what the system could be in the future.
Right.
So, as you're defining and putting these boundaries around this smaller and more limited in scope, not only do you have to think about the systems that you're going to be supporting right when you go live, but what else are people thinking of? What's the marketing department out there drinking vodka at lunch, thinking that the next thing that they're going to sell?
Yeah.
Because you also have to try to keep those things in mind too as you're planning this out.
Yeah. I
Oh,
I just want to stop real quick. I'm really sorry we're getting spam with porn. My show is so popular that they're spamming porn in my chat room, in the chat. So I'm really sorry about that. Simon will take care of it. And right before that started happening, I was going to say, please send your questions. Mahesh had a comment, but please send your questions if you have questions for Bill, because we have an expert here. So this is your time to ask. I forgot to say that at the beginning, so I'm sorry.
is there some place that I'd be able to see them, or am I going to have
Yeah,
to?
if you go to comments on the StreamYard, you can see all the the questions coming from the other
Okay.
3
Oh,
platforms,
oh, wow. Okay.
4 platforms. Yeah. So Mahesh says not only tracking, they listen to what you're talking about, push stuff everywhere. Some hagglers are so bad they start showing you ads after you've already bought an item. Yeah,
That
Amazon.
that's my favorite thing, is I finally decided what printer I got, so I ordered it, and then all of a sudden I'm still getting them 3 months later.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't
I
I
mean,
don't need 10 printers. I'm
yeah.
not even sure I need one. But
Yeah. Well, my biggest thing is, Amazon, I mean, Alexa's got this thing now where they'll say, hey, we think it's time for you to order more popcorn, and the thing that really frustrates me is I just ordered that yesterday. Why are you telling me to order popcorn? Aren't you talking to each other over there in Amazon?
and no, they're not.
No, they're not. I mean, yeah, that's the problem.
um, um, Mahesh has got a good question in there. Spending a little bit of time around the cost of maintaining multiple microservices versus a single web API.
Yeah.
And It's really hard to generalize what costing would look like because it really comes down to usage. So if you've got a microservices that's going to be always hit, that's always going to be in operations, and there's going to be a certain level or certain threshold that's always going to be active. At that point, you can make your decision on how you're going to host it, really based around economics and things like containers. It may make sense to have a container that can handle 30 or 40 concurrent requests as opposed
Mhm.
to 20 or 30 Lambda or Azure function running at a time.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so so it really comes down, I think, to the amount of usage that your microservice is going to have. But what you're going to end up finding, I think, is that moving to microservices will generally probably end up costing slightly more than having a single web API because the economics are not going to be strictly in how much does it cost to process the request. But imagine you went from one CI/CD pipeline to 10 CI/CD
Mhm.
pipelines.
Yeah.
Each one of those is going to have some kind of a maintenance request or maintenance requirement for it. Each one of those is going to deploy differently, so you'll probably end up doing more deployments around it. So you'll get code out faster, but that code is probably going to cost you more per function point than what you had before.
Yeah. Yeah. Mahesh says recently we
Yeah.
found a large telecom client end up costing 15 to 20 times more compared to traditional web APIs. Yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me, especially if you're
Yeah.
looking
Me
at
neither.
the economics around the entire thing. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. You're
Well,
basically
yeah. If you look at, just to do that, I mean, the architecture is probably harder. You probably have to spend more. You do have to spend more time architecting and things like that. It's and all that time, costs money.
yeah,
And hopefully they're architecting it correctly and not just
yeah,
sitting down and writing microservices. Yeah, that would be really bad.
yeah.
But yeah, I can definitely see how they actually in the end cost more, but have a better benefit, to the users. I think,
Yeah.
as far as their workflow,
Yeah, because
debug, deployment. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, but I think I will argue a little bit with the comment that you just put in there, Mahesh, because I think that it doesn't take longer to develop the microservice approach. If you're starting a greenfield application, I would argue that it's actually faster to develop using a microservices um, with all the things that we're talking about there with message enabled, independently built and deployed. I would say in the length of your project, it'd probably be quicker and you'd get more done more reliably if you're taking a microservice approach.
yeah,
But you have to take it from the beginning and you
yeah,
have to
yeah.
approach it that way because a lot of the things I talked about the scale of being able to do it. Well, if you create one DevOps pipeline, many places you just, for lack of a better term, copy and paste that pipeline over for the next microservice. So a lot
Right.
of the weight and pain that you have about managing those will go away.
Yeah,
But what it does then is it allows you to be able to manage each one of those as discrete pieces of functionality, and you can deploy it quicker. Your testing cycles become a lot faster. You could test each one a lot better. Um, sure, debug is a pain, especially if you're trying to track something across 10 microservices. I mean,
yeah,
that's that's a sheer way to get a migraine right there or a hangover the next day. But
yeah.
I would argue that you'd probably get your project done faster. And I'd like
Yeah.
and I'm curious as to what you think, Dave.
Yeah, well, I think if you're talking about starting off that way, yes, definitely. If you have a monolithic old style that app that's 10 or 20 years old, then it probably will be slower and more costly, until things get moved over, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that for sure. Trying to inject a different architecture into your current
Yeah.
architecture is always going to be a little more costly and take
Yeah.
a little more time, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, and you bring up a really good point because it really comes down to whether or not you've got greenfield on brand new stuff that you're building, or if you're trying to do some kind of an architectural reframeworking or something like
right.
that,
Yeah.
because that becomes brutal.
Yeah. And the
Um,
other thing I was just thinking about really while you were talking was one thing I haven't thought about before is, if anybody watches me knows I'm really big into documentation, and I don't think enough things are documented properly. Most companies I go into, I ask them for documentation. They go, "What documentation?" Right? Or if they give it to me, it's 5 years old, right? So I would think it's a lot more important to proper, really good documentation on microservices and keep that up to date, because how does that microservice team knows what the hell your microservice is doing if you don't document this stuff, right?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I know a lot of developers that would argue that, I've got Swagger, so my API will be self-documenting, because
No, that's
you just
not what I'm talking about.
right, and that's it exactly, because once again it's back to the whole system. It's like, how do you explain the little boundaries, the
Right.
API calls that I do and the objects that I request in and return? Sure, that tells me how to interact with that service, but that tells you nothing about what the microservice means in the context of the business itself and of the
Yeah.
systems that you're trying to solve.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to bring up, I'm not sure, I don't think we're going to have too much time to dedicate to this. We can always have a different show and talk about this more. I think we're going to have you back on, because this is a big subject. But one of the things I found really, really frustrating when I first started doing microservices. So my first microservices project was with .NET, but we were using AWS. And at that time, you'll have to tell me if AWS has made this easier, but the thing I found the hardest was the orchestration between the microservices, right? And so when I did this, and Amazon didn't have a really good way to do that, I had to do a lot more work, with the eventing and queuing and things like that. I had personally had to think through and do and code. Whereas, right around that time, Azure was coming out with what they call durable functions, which allows you to easily create a workflow without doing all that stuff that I had to do with AWS, right? And, after I got done with this project, I was going, oh man, I wish I could have used durable functions. I could have got done so much quicker, and so that's a big thing, right? And you talked about a little bit before, how do these things communicate, or how does one microservices know to do something when this microservice is done with it, right? And that's where kind of like durable functions can really help out, that because it's all magic behind the hoods. All you do is configure it, and that's basically it.
So when you're doing that, are you basically is the way that you were thinking about managing that, is that you have some starter function that's the first one that gets called, and then it does its processing, and then it sprays out an event that some other set of functions are listening to, that then they do their work, and then they set out
that's kind of the way it works with durable functions. Is you have one overarching microservices, but then that microservices also defines the other ones that will be called or whatever during it, right? And so that's how it works in Azure, at least.
Yeah, so AWS does have step functions, which sounds like it's much the same, but it's a very defined, that at first thou shalt do A, then thou shalt do B, and then thou shalt do C.
No. I think durable functions is a little bit more, I would say more like I don't know. Someone could tell me if I'm wrong if you use durable functions, but more like a state machine, I would say, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, and that's interesting. So it's and that's, I think, part of one of the things that you have to kind of think about is as you're planning out your microservice footprint, is how is it going to manage? How is it going to work? Right. If you're a company that is able to say, I'm going to go with one cloud provider, well, you can kind of customize your stuff, and you can take advantage of Azure's durable functions or AWS's step functions, whichever makes the most sense. But then think about what you have to do if you're one of those companies that's decided that they're going hybrid, and they're going to be in a multi-cloud environment. For those days when AWS is not responsive, or those days when Azure is not responsive.
right?
Which
It's not
happens
99%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not 100%, right?
Yeah.
We've seen this over and over again, right? Where Facebook was locked out of everything,
Yeah.
right? Because of one stupid thing, you know, and I that doesn't have anything to do with microservices, but yeah, you're right. It's it could be really tough.
Yeah, because then it falls back to being able to define and well understand. Because I've also seen instances where I don't know how to put it, less experienced developers perhaps rely on the functionality of a specific system.
Mhm.
So I know I'm in AWS, and I know that AWS Lambda has these event structures coming out of them once it's done processing. So I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to use that for everything. And
Mhm.
so they get into the mindset of defining and building their applications around that kind of an approach, which means then they go through the inevitable CTO change, and all of a sudden everything's got to moved over to Azure.
Yeah, right.
We've all lived through something
That
like that.
happened in my last
Yeah,
contract, right?
yeah,
They,
yeah.
they decided they hate Microsoft, and
Yeah,
so everything's going to Java, right?
yeah. As a consultant, I mean, I paid for my car by that kind of problem.
Yeah.
So, um, but what that means then is when they get to that new one, all of a sudden they're having problems understanding how to do that and what that
Mhm.
means, because it's different enough, and they don't have an understanding of the basic approach around messaging and message queues and how to manage that and how to manage communications between those. And
Right.
even if we talked about the problems of what the payloads look like and things like that, you get buried into a specific implementation of it, and all of a sudden the architecture is is beyond you. You're once
Mhm.
again you're looking at the trees, and the whole forest is something that you can't take advantage of.
Yeah.
So
Mahesh made a comment I like. No one reads documentation these days. Young generation don't like to read unless there are likes. So Mahesh, when we write documentation, maybe we should have a liking system so the young people will read it, right?
well,
But he's right. He's correct. I know that.
the only ones that read documentation are the people that are onboarding to the project.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your new hires coming in and your consultants that are coming in.
Managing multiple databases and their transactions. Oh, I guess he's asking, how do you manage multiple databases and transactions when it comes to microservice architecture?
Yeah, that's actually a very common problem, and there's a couple things that I want you to think about for that. A is, why do you need a transaction?
Hmm.
What does a transaction buy you here?
Right.
And what's the business purpose of it? Because there's the technological reasons for transactions, but
Sure.
what's the business reasons for it? Um, and of course, there are patterns that you can take. SWAT, something like that. I can't remember the acronym for it, but there are actually implementation patterns for distributed transaction management,
Mhm.
which is basically you kind of have a each service provides the event about when they've done their part of it, and then you've got some other orchestrator system that's kind of just watching all those events that they come in, and once it gets this particular set of events, could be one because it was one, or it could be 50 of them. um, it'll be able to then determine that the transaction is completed,
Yeah.
and if it doesn't get any, it can then raise the appropriate alarm about this particular service didn't get it. um,
Right. Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's a good question, because I think a lot of what you're seeing is that, using microservices is going to make more work,
yeah.
in essentially, and I mean more work. I mean about the orchestration around the microservices, right? I'm not necessarily talking about coding. I'm talking about the orchestration and the architecture around it, so it works properly and not go
Mhm.
down, when ticket sales go on, right?
Yeah, and that and that's, once again, that's just kind of points out what the whole complexity of this is,
Mhm.
because as you kind of bring the scale of those microservices down and make them more finite, all of a sudden orchestration then has to happen somehow and somewhere, which
It
means either
does.
you have some orchestration engine. Because I remember I went through a phase probably 6 or 7 years ago where I had an orchestrator phase, where I had one piece of code that was responsible for understanding all the relationships between all of the different services behind it. So that was really more of the old school service oriented architecture approach, where there was an order service that you would both create an order and ship an order through it. It had a whole bunch of methods on it, just like you would probably have on an order class if you were working with it. But then there was that orchestrator that contained all of the business logic for it.
Yeah.
That's kind of evolved now. And now the business logic is built into each one of the microservices by making it responsible for understanding what is going through the pipeline and what it cares about.
And
then not only that, but what does it care about and what parts of the thing that did it hear about that it cares about? So that's once again where that whole architecture and that system design approach gets really vicious. And I mean, and quite frankly, you're going to get it wrong more than you're going to get it right.
Yes, probably, especially in the beginning.
oh yeah, and some new piece of functionality is going to be requested, and you're going to be like, "Well, poop." So do I add 4 pieces of data onto this thing that's very similar to it, or do I make a new message?
A new one.
And then all of a sudden you've got 1,000 messages that you're trying to monitor as they go through the system. And then it becomes, as a new service comes in, well, do I care about this message or do I care about this message? Because the only difference are these 3 points of data, but I only need one of those. Do I really, really need it? Or do I just want it? You know, and
I would love to hear from somebody at AWS that's like on the Alexa team, right? To kind of show how they do it, right? Because I must say, in most cases, my Alexa is pretty freaking fast. Whatever I tell it to do, it figures it out amazingly fast, and so that's all through microservices, right? And so, how did they do that and orchestrate that to make it work like that? Because just me thinking about how they do that, just my mind blows up a little bit. It's too much for me to think about.
Well, I know one of the developer advocates for Alexa. I bet you I could probably get him on if you want him.
Yeah,
or at least send you an intro.
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Okay.
But we actually do have to wrap up here in a minute. So, I hope you guys got just a little bit of taste on microservices and the challenges that you're going to face. I think this has been a great episode because, a lot of people say, well, microservices will solve your problems. And, this episode says, well, yeah, but you're going to have to worry about this stuff. So be aware of it, especially when you're talking to the people in charge of the money and stuff like that. But I would love to have you back on because we didn't really talk about orchestration that much. We didn't talk about telemetry, which is a big deal in microservices, and lots of other things. So, I'm going to have you back on, and maybe after done your book, we can get you back on. I was thinking maybe on a regular basis because microservices is a big deal, and I don't think a lot of people really truly understand what they are and how to do it and how to avoid the pitfalls, right? And
one of the best sessions that I think I ever gave out was converting a monolithic application to microservices, and it was a 2-day workshop. And just the questions that were raised from that almost lead to. It's almost we could just have one of those questions and spend an hour talking through what it really means. It's like some of the ones that Pranam's been putting in here about security and stuff like that.
Yeah, we didn't talk about security either. Yeah. Or just standing up a gateway. I mean, there's so much that's part of microservices. It's just not the microservice itself. There's a lot going on around it.
You're right. We didn't talk about the infrastructure, about the load balancers or the API gateways or whatever you've got going around it to serve them. So,
yeah. And on my next project, this is where I'm going. I haven't really said it much out there, but I got a new position, and I'll be the architect of taking the old project into the new world, right? And so what we're talking about right now is exactly what I'm going to be doing in a couple of weeks. And so, This has been a great episode for me personally, because it's things I need to think about now that I'm going to be an architect of this kind of stuff, so yeah, that's why I think I was selfishly thinking, I got to have Bill on a regular basis because I'm going to need help with this project.
Well, great, because then we can talk through some of the problems that you've run into, and I'll have the ones that I'm running into, because I've got a greenfield one that's coming through, and it's going to have its own set of we shouldn't have done it this way.
Yeah. So I did want to ask real quick, how much do you talk about microservices in your new book that you're coming out with?
Well, there's probably 6 or 7 chapters around it, but most of it is more on the AWS side, and just how to interact with your .NET application with it. But there is a whole section around microservice. I mean, because that's what you'll talk about containers, and you can get some stuff about Lambda. But there are some parts about there's a distributed architecture chapter and things like that. So there is some on there. But
okay, cool. So there's 2 questions I always ask everybody before they go. First is do you have anything to plug before we go? Nope. Okay, great. That makes it easy. and second is, what do you do for fun that isn't coding? And not playing with your cat. Okay, something else.
Well, there's 2 things that I like to do in tandem, and I'm a huge reader, and I like reading trash. So if there's something
like
out
actual
on
trash laying on the street,
okay, maybe a little bit more structured than that. So if it's got some crazy young adult classification on Amazon books, and it's like vampires or space goblins or something like that, I'll probably read it, because it just relaxes me.
Yeah.
And then I drink beer. So
well, you live in Seattle, right? You gotta have to drink beer in Seattle, right?
Yeah, it's kind of the law, I think. That or coffee.
Yeah, actually, the first brewery I ever went to when I was in my early 20s in the Navy, we took a trip up to Seattle. My first visit to Seattle was actually on a U.S. Navy ship, and went to my first brewery and managed to get drink tickets from other people so I could get a little tipsy before I left. But yeah, I think it was, I don't know if you still have it. It's I think it's Mount Rainier beer or something like that.
There's Rainier Brewing. Yeah,
yeah. That's where we went. Yeah.
It's closed. So
it's kind of shitty beer anyway. So,
but you just said that you were in the Navy. If I'd have known that, I wouldn't have agreed to do this. As a former Marine. So.
Yeah. That's old military people. All right, I gotta let you go before Simon gets mad at me about the time. So I really appreciate you being on this. Like I said, I want to have you back on a bunch of times, actually, because I think we've just opened up the can of worms to microservices, and I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger subject as we go through this world in the near future.
Okay, well, I'm more than happy to, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right.
Wow, that was a great session. A great episode with Bill. I learned a lot, commiserated a lot with Bill, and we talked about a bunch of things that we weren't really specific on. But like I said, I'm going to try my hardest to get Bill back on. If you want me to get Bill back on, make a comment here or email me at the email address at the end of the show. We got a couple more slides and we got to go. So everybody wins a copy of Code Rush from DevExpress. Just go to devexpress.com/dotNetDave and get your real license copy. It's not fake or time limited or anything. It's a real license copy of Code Rush. Code Rush is the only refactoring tool I've ever used in .NET. It helps me to be a more productive developer, and it makes me learn stuff too. So every time I say that, I think to myself, I wish I was getting paid for that. So anyway, go check it out. If you like it or don't like it, either way, let me know. I'd like to hear your comments on DevExpress. And if you have something you want added to Code Rush, let me know. I know the guy who runs the company, so I can get it on. Thanks, Paran, it was a great session. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to pick up a copy of David McCarter, Rock Your Code, Coding Standards for Microsoft.net. I decided to plug it this week because, based on most of the code that I see currently in my previous job, everybody needs a copy of this because far too many people don't do anything about coding standards. So I hope you go pick up a copy today. And I had some humor today. I saw this on Twitter. What do you do for work? I'm a programmer. And the person thinks, can you? No. How many people have done that, right? Somebody finds out you're a software engineer and they start, oh my gosh, one time I was in the airport and I had a Windows shirt on. Oh, people would not stop bugging me. So I don't wear Windows shirts in the airport anymore. And every one of my girlfriends has said, oh, you can fix my printer for me. Okay, I guess I got to do that. But yeah, no, not unless I get something in return. Please help me help the kids in India. I've been raising over $500 in this GoFundMe. As you know, I've been to India 3 times. The last time I went to this orphanage, and I've been raising money for the orphanage ever since. And that money has led to helping them get their vocational training for women back running again. I'm really proud of that. And so please take a minute after the show and go to that link, or just go to voiceofslum.org. That's where this is run through, and you can donate money. You can buy school supplies for the kids. You can buy clothing for the kids, which they really need. So please help the kids in Delhi because they really, really need our help. All right. Well, thanks for watching. Next week, I have Richard Campbell. I think most of you, if you watch Carl Franklin or any of that, or .NET Rocks, you know who Richard is. I've known him for a long time, and I'm really happy. He's from Canada. He's going to be on the show next week, and we're actually going to be doing something special on the show. So you're going to have to come back and watch what we're going to be doing for that show. Please be safe out there. COVID is still not going great, even in America, even though we're all really relaxing things. We're still, last time I heard, we're still having 2,000 deaths a day. So please be safe out there. Listen to your medical professionals, and please donate blood if you can. Most of you can, so go do it. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything, and it makes you feel better about being a human because you get to help your fellow human. I think that's the best thing in the world. And with that, I want to thank everybody for being here. Please email me any suggestions or comments, or if there's anybody you want me to have on the show except for Bill Gates, email me and I will try to get them on. And Scott Guthrie too. I don't think I'd ever be able to get him on. He's too important. So please email me. I want to hear from you. I don't hear enough stuff about the show. So this show is for you. And the only way I can make it better for you is if you communicate with me. So there's the email address. And with that, I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.